Hello and welcome to today's webinar. We're very happy you could join us. My name is Brianna Humphreys and I am the Marketing Manager for K-12 Education Products here at Brooks Publishing. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few brief housekeeping items. You will be muted for the webinar, but if you have any questions during today's presentation, please type them into the questions box. We'll take all questions after the presentation during the Q&A portion of the webinar. For the presentation, you might want to minimize the GoToWebinar bar on your monitor so you can see more of your screen. To do so, you can just click the orange button with the arrow in the top corner of your control bar. And if you need to enlarge the bar again to ask a question, simply click that orange button again. If you experience any audio issues at any point, you can switch to phone by clicking in the audio section of your webinar panel and using the dial-in information that's provided. Also, just a quick housekeeping note, we will be recording today's webinar, so everyone who registered for the event will receive a link to the recording in a follow-up email tomorrow. I am very happy to announce that Brooks will be giving away 3 copies of Louise Spear-Swirling's book, The Power of RTI and Reading Profiles today. Winners will receive an email after today's webinar and will be randomly selected. If you want to increase your chances, be sure to submit your questions in the questions panel throughout the presentation today. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Louise Spear-Swirling. Louise Spear-Swirling is Professor Emerita in the Department of Special Education at Southern Connecticut State University. Dr. Spear-Swirling's research interests include literacy acquisition, reading difficulties, and teacher education, and she has published many peer-reviewed articles and book chapters on these topics. In addition to consulting for K-12 public schools and state departments of education, she has for more than 3 decades helped prepare both general and special educators to teach reading using structured literacy approaches. Louise, thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure. I'm so happy to be here. So thank you so much to everybody who signed up and is here for the webinar. I'm going to give you a whirlwind introduction to common types of reading difficulties, and I won't have as much time to discuss certain details that I normally would, but hopefully if you have questions, I can address those issues in questions. So if you've worked teaching reading or you've worked with poor readers, you're probably very receptive to the idea that not all reading problems are alike. But I think that one thing that's less well known is that we have a large body of research that strongly supports the idea that there are 3 common types, 3 profiles of reading difficulties. And this is useful information to teachers in particular because it has a lot of practical implications for choosing interventions, for progress monitoring, for accommodations, and a lot of decisions that you have to make as an educator. Poor reader profiles are based in the simple view of reading, which says that good reading comprehension depends on 2 broad factors. The 2 broad factors are good word recognition and good oral language comprehension. So according to the simple view, you need both of these things to have good reading comprehension. And then as you can see there, each of the broad factors includes a number of, you could think of them as subcomponents. So letter sound knowledge and phonological decoding skills and automaticity for word recognition, and equally a host of areas for good oral language comprehension like vocabulary knowledge and syntactic comprehension and so forth. And then the 3 profiles of reading difficulty just flow from the simple view. So if a student is a poor reader, they could be low in one of those 2 factors, but not the other one, or they could be low in both of them. So children with the first profile, specific word recognition difficulties, have reading problems where the difficulty is specific to word recognition or decoding, which is usually the core problem. But oral language comprehension is average or better. Children with specific comprehension difficulties have the opposite profile. So the reading problem is specific to oral language comprehension, which then affects reading comprehension. But word decoding and, just in general reading words is average or better. And then children with mixed reading difficulties have problems in both areas, both word recognition and oral comprehension of language. And if you're like me and you do better with a graphic, here's a table that shows the three profiles, the three common profiles of reading difficulty. So in the left-hand column, you see the three profiles, and then for each profile, what the student's word recognition and decoding skills are, and what their oral language comprehension would be. For each profile of reading difficulties, there are somewhat different intervention needs. The profile provides a good starting point for planning intervention. It doesn't tell you all you need to know, but it provides an extremely helpful starting point. Also, I think another thing that's not well recognized is that each profile tends to manifest in somewhat different ways in math and written expression. And this is really because the profiles involve underlying strengths and weaknesses in language. And that those patterns of strengths and weaknesses in language, like phonology versus vocabulary knowledge and broad language comprehension, play out in a certain way in other subjects, not just reading. And then I've emboldened this one because it's important for me to emphasize that each profile can be associated with a variety of underlying causes. So a student, for example, with a specific word profile might have dyslexia, or they might have had inadequate phonics instruction. A student with a specific comprehension difficulty profile, might have a language disability, or they might have just had limited exposure to English language or literacy. Nevertheless, although the profile doesn't necessarily tell you the cause of the child's reading problem, it's got practical implications for how to work with the child. So I decided to organize the webinar today around 3 examples of children, and these are based on real children with differing profiles, but with the names and details changed, so they're not recognizable. So these are 3 4th graders. They're all students with below average performance in reading comprehension, and they're all students with below average performance in silent reading fluency. But as we'll see, they have quite different profiles, leading to different implications for intervention. So Molly is a student whose reading difficulties were first noted in grade 1. Her early difficulties in reading centered on phoneme blending and decoding. And as a 4th grader, she's made some progress, but she still struggles with word reading, and particularly decoding of multisyllabic words and automaticity of decoding. And her spelling is also weak. But she's the kind of student who's always done very well in teacher read-alouds and class discussions. She has strong ideas for writing, but because she's a poor speller, that tends to drain her motivation to write. She gets bogged down in trying to get the words on the page. She has good math problem-solving abilities in terms of abilities like deciding on the correct operation or filtering out relevant and irrelevant information, as long as the problem is read to her. But she often ends up with the wrong answer because she tends to make fact errors, like multiplication table errors, like saying 5 times 6 is 36 or something like that. If she can read something, she can comprehend it. So her reading comprehension is good if she can decode the text. And her teacher's assessments show accuracy and automaticity of decoding are below average, but her vocabulary knowledge and listening comprehension are solidly average. So Molly is a student who's an example of specific word recognition difficulties. Her weaknesses cluster in word reading, decoding, and spelling, but she has strengths in her oral vocabulary knowledge and oral language comprehension. So what kinds of intervention needs would she have? Well, again, here, please keep in mind that I'm giving you the Cliff Notes, the really quick version. But this is the kind of student who will typically benefit from explicit systematic phonics intervention. In Molly's case, it needs to be focused on multisyllabic words because that's her current level, and perhaps also developing automaticity, which was noted as a problem. She also needs to apply her decoding skills in text reading, including some oral text reading with a teacher. Children with Mali often, when they're reading in text, we kind of over rely on context cues, and they'll make small errors, what seem like small errors, such as reading for the for this for that. It's important for the teacher to not ignore those kinds of errors, because we want Mali to develop habits of looking carefully at words in print, whether it's in text or whether it's isolated words. And that becomes a foundation for building fluency. Accuracy is a prerequisite for fluency. Other activities that might benefit her fluency are things like repeated reading of text or wide reading of text. And notice, although she had low reading comprehension, she doesn't need intervention in comprehension. Her reading comprehension problems are based entirely in decoding. That's where she needs intervention. Calvin, the second student, had no history of reading difficulties at the K-3 level, unlike Mali. His development of phonemic awareness and decoding skills was typical, unremarkable, no sign of reading problems. His reading difficulties were first identified early in grade 4, and right now his biggest difficulties involve vocabulary weaknesses, limitations in background knowledge, and inferencing. And Calvin has similar difficulties in listening and class discussions as well as in reading. It doesn't really matter if he's listening or if he's reading it. Decoding is not an issue. Language comprehension is his issue. He has grade appropriate spelling, and that's partly because he has good phonological skills, but the composition aspects of writing, such as word choice, clarity, and elaboration of writing, are weak. Math problem solving is a significant weakness. That would include things like deciding the correct operation, finding relevant information in a problem. Again, those types of skills tend to be especially language based. So it's his language weaknesses playing out in the area of math. Teacher assessments in reading show that he has excellent word recognition and decoding skills, even above average, but his listening comprehension and oral vocabulary knowledge are below average. So Calvin is an example of a student with specific comprehension difficulties, strengths in word reading, decoding, and spelling with no history of problems in these areas, but he has weaknesses in vocabulary knowledge and overall language comprehension. In terms of intervention, Calvin needs interventions focused on vocabulary development, explicit teaching of important words, instruction in morphology, which can also help build vocabulary. So teaching the student that a root word like geo, G-E-O, means earth, can help them comprehend semantically related words like geology, geography, geographer, and so on. Explicit teaching of background knowledge, especially in relation to the text he is reading, background knowledge that he needs to understand what he has to read in school. And then oral discussion of text to probe the basis of his inferencing problems, because poor inferencing can come from different things. Maybe it's his lack of background knowledge that's affecting his inferencing, or he doesn't know the meaning of a word. And also the oral discussion of text and building oral language skills will promote a deeper level of engagement with the text and develop language skills that he needs for good reading comprehension. Doing this could also help him in math and writing by building his language skills, especially if there's some coordination with those areas, like teaching of math-related vocabulary, for example. Although Calvin had a low score on the silent reading fluency measure, note that he probably will not benefit from the same types of activities that should benefit Mali, such as repeated reading of text. That's because Calvin's reading difficulties are based in vocabulary and language comprehension, not decoding. He reads slowly because he's struggling to comprehend, not because he's having a problem with reading words. Fluency techniques such as repeated readings emphasize building accuracy and automaticity of word reading, which is not a need for Calvin. However, improvements in his vocabulary and his language comprehension should ultimately benefit his reading fluency. And I'm now turning to the last child, Jose, another fourth grader who happens to be an English learner. He's a native Spanish speaker. His reading difficulties were evident when he first entered the school system in grade 3. He currently has difficulties with decoding of multisyllabic words and automaticity of decoding, like Mali, and his spelling is also weak. But unlike Mali, he has weaknesses in vocabulary knowledge and background knowledge, like Calvin does. And these difficulties are evident in read-alouds and oral discussions, as well as in his reading. Teacher assessments show that his decoding is mildly below average. So it's not extremely low, but it is below average. However, his vocabulary knowledge in English is well below average. And we're not making a statement about his Spanish vocabulary knowledge. I don't have that information. So Spanish vocabulary knowledge could be good, but we know that at least in English, his vocabulary knowledge is low, and that will certainly affect his reading comprehension in English. Also, his reading comprehension is lower than his oral language comprehension due to the influence of decoding. So oral language comprehension is somewhat low, and then reading comprehension is even lower than that. So Jose has a profile of mixed reading difficulties with mild weaknesses in word reading and more significant weaknesses in vocabulary and oral language comprehension. What are his intervention needs? Explicit systematic phonics intervention focused on multisyllabic words, similar to Mali, and activities to build fluency, again, similar to Mali, but activities to build vocabulary and language comprehension like Calvin, so a combination of those types of activities aimed at his needs in language comprehension and his needs in word reading. I should note with Jose, teaching of morphology could be especially beneficial. So if you teach a student like Jose of the meaning, earlier I used the example of the root geo, he could learn not only its meaning, but how to read it and how to spell it, and that will kind of simultaneously benefit his word reading, his spelling, and his vocabulary knowledge. And some children who have a mixed profile, if decoding is really low, they might not be ready for these longer kinds of words, but Jose is. So he would be an excellent candidate for this kind of teaching. Also, I don't want to give the impression that Jose's needs are just a combination of the other two children, and really this could be true for a child with any of the profiles. He does require intervention that's targeted to his unique needs, other unique needs, and in Jose's case, it would be his characteristics and needs as an English learner. So an important thing to do with English learners is to exploit their cognate knowledge. For example, Jose probably knows a word like delicioso in Spanish means delicious, and there's an English cognate. So exploiting cognate knowledge could help expand. It's one technique to help expand his English vocabulary. Poor reader profiles may also be associated with certain patterns of difficulties in math and written expression, and I've sort of touched on these a little bit in the examples of the three children. So children with the first profile, specific word recognition difficulties, are almost always poor spellers, but what's often less recognized is that they often have difficulty with automatic recall of math facts, like Mali. And then that could then affect broader calculation skills because the child is so bogged down in fact recall. Children with specific comprehension difficulties often have trouble with the language demands of math, especially aspects of math that are particularly language dependent, such as problem solving. And the composition aspects of writing. For instance, if a child has vocabulary weaknesses, those are going to play out in their written expression as well as in their reading comprehension. Children with mixed reading difficulties often have broad weaknesses in multiple components of math and written expression. But it's important to note that for all the profiles, difficulties may vary from mild to severe. So for instance, a student with a mixed profile does not necessarily have the most severe reading impairment. It's just that the pattern of difficulty is kind of a broad pattern across different components. So to sum up, 3 common poor reader profiles are well documented in research: specific word recognition difficulties, specific comprehension difficulties, and mixed reading difficulties. Identification of a child's profile can provide an excellent starting point for planning intervention. It can, in some cases, have implications for understanding a poor reader's performance in math and written expression. And poor reader profiles are useful across a wide grade range and for students with and without disability. Thank you so much for your attention and for attending the webinar. And I guess I'll turn it over now for questions. And Brianna, maybe you can help me with this part.
Of course, yeah. So we've been getting a lot of great questions. If anybody has questions, please feel free to submit them now. One question that we've received is, are some reading difficulties masked by other learning disabilities such as ADD?
Oh, that is a great question. Yes, I have seen that many times. So here's a common pattern that I see in a child who has ADHD, especially a boy, where behavior problems are often, kind of noted more often, or they may manifest more often. We're not sure about that, but sometimes it's the attentional issue that gets the attention first, and that becomes the way that people think about the child. Well, it's an attentional problem, and particularly if the reading problem is a milder type of difficulty, the reading problem can get overlooked. And yet there's a high co-occurrence between reading disorders and ADHD. So I think definitely with a student who has this sort of, attentional deficit diagnosis, it's always good to double check for possible reading problems.
Thank you for that response. Another question that we've been getting a couple different ways is, how early can you start to identify children who might be struggling with reading in these different reading profiles?
Well, we know that we can identify risk in actually very young children, even preschool children. Now, I wouldn't want to make the argument that the profiles are, should be applied to preschoolers. I think most of the research we have on the poor reader profiles is aimed more at children from, the primary grades on. So let's say grade 1 and up, or maybe kindergarten and up. But if the question is about identifying risk for reading difficulties, we can definitely do that even, before many kids enter school. So things like if there's a family history of reading disorders like dyslexia, if a child has a history of specific language impairment or early language delay, certainly once they get into kindergarten, things like, if this child is struggling with learning letters or phonological awareness skills, sensitivity to sounds in the speech stream, those things would be very important indicators.
Thank you for that response. Another question we've received is if you can suggest any informal assessments you might use to identify instructional needs for each type of reading difficulty.
Well, I think certainly for children who have decoding needs, the question was about informal assessments, right? Was that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
So I think for children who have decoding needs, criterion referenced measures like the core phonics survey is one very useful assessment. One assessment that I've used a lot that's similar to the core phonics survey is called the Gallistel-Ellis test of coding skills. The Gallistel-Ellis is similar to the core phonics survey, but it's got more categories at the two-syllable and multi-syllable stage. So I find it particularly useful with like an older student who is functioning, who has decoding needs, but isn't functioning at an extremely low level. So for decoding needs, those types of assessments, and there are definitely others as well, could help you target, the specific decoding skills that the student needs instruction in. For comprehension, I think comprehension covers so much territory. It's a little bit trickier. I do think that formal assessment, if a student is suspected of having serious reading problems and in the domain of comprehension, some kind of formal standardized assessment of at least broad listening comprehension and vocabulary can be really useful. It can be hard to tell if a student's weaknesses are mild. It can be hard to tell just from their language. But in the absence of, or I should say hard to tell just informally. But in the absence of that, I would think about something like an informal reading inventory where a student has to read a series of passages and answer questions. And that kind of assessment can also be administered verbally. So in a listening comprehension assessment, the child doesn't do the reading. The teacher does the reading, or the examiner does the reading of the passage. And then the child answers the questions. So listening comprehension versions of informal reading inventories kind of give you an indicator of how well the child comprehends when there's no demand for them to decode. And that can be useful. The informal measures just don't have the same technical adequacy as a formal assessment. So that's why I would go with a formal assessment if it's possible. But in the absence of that, the informal assessments, can certainly give you a useful starting point for instruction. And you can look for things like, does a student have more difficulty on certain kinds of questions, like literal questions versus inferencing questions or vocabulary questions and so forth. Oh, you know what? One last thing, let me add. I forgot to mention, I didn't think of this assessment at first because I was thinking informal, and I wouldn't really call this an informal assessment, but CBM, or curriculum-based measurement, is a very useful way, especially at the elementary level, to assess a number of different reading skills, both oral reading fluency, oral reading accuracy, and maze comprehension, which is kind of a basic indicator of comprehension. Some of you in the audience may be using those in your school districts to do universal screening. It's not really an informal assessment, but it's a quick assessment. It doesn't take the amount of time that a standardized test battery takes. So those can be very useful also, particularly at the K to 6 grade level.
Great, thanks so much. There's a lot of great information that you just provided. I think in the interest of time, we'll take one more question for our live webinar. So someone has asked, to contribute to later fluency, would Molly, who was explained in your presentation, also benefit from some explicit instruction in advanced phonemic awareness or phoneme proficiency, as suggested by David Kilpatrick?
Yes, I have sometimes recommended this, and I didn't have those. Dr. Kilpatrick has as I'm sure the questioner is aware, has a test, and I didn't have those test data or data on a comparable type of test for Molly. But if she had limitations in that area, then that is definitely something I would consider. Yes, this is a difficult problem for, as some people in the audience might recognize, Molly has a profile similar to dyslexia. And there's not enough data provided in the case to make a judgment about that, but in fact, she's modeled after a real student with dyslexia. And a significant issue for many of those students is that even with really good phonics intervention, they sometimes don't build automaticity of reading real words. They don't build, what's sometimes called in education sight word knowledge. And there is, some preliminary evidence that the advanced phonemic awareness training might help with that, and I would certainly consider it for that type of student.
Thanks so much, Louise. Like I said, since believe it or not, we've already hit that 2:30 mark, I think we're going to have to end the Q&A portion of today's webinar, but I really appreciate you responding to all the questions we got to cover today.
My pleasure.
Just a quick few notes from Brooks before we end today's webinar. I'm very happy to share that Brooks will be offering a 20% discount on all of our products from now through the end of June using the promo code Coffee Talk. So from now till June, you can save 20% on anything on the Brooks Publishing website, including Dr. Spear-Swirling's book, The Power of RTI and Reading Profiles. So if anyone's looking for additional resources during these times, please feel free to check out our website. And if you're looking for more professional development webinar opportunities over the next couple of weeks, be sure to visit our website for the latest additions to our Coffee Chat series. You can do so by just visiting the website address listed on your screen now. And if you need any additional support too, we also have a list of COVID-19 resources available. So we have a bunch of recommended reading, downloadable resources, and professional development webinars, both from Brooks and from other organizations as well. So please feel free to visit our website and stay tuned for additional information that'll be posted over the coming weeks. So again, thank you so much for everyone who attended today's webinar, and we're very thankful to have Dr. Louise Spear-Swirling today to share her insight and knowledge. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me.
Have a great rest of your day, everyone.
You too.